Hi everyone, we're going to look a little deeper into the martial attack in this video. So let's recall the moves. So the martial attack is a variation in the Ruy Lopez, which we have here, and it occurs after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and now black plays the closed variation with bishop e7. Okay, then rook e1. Now the threat is to take our knight, removing the defender of the e5 pawn and then taking on e5. So we prevent that by playing b5. The bishop falls back. And now the main line would continue with d6. But the martial attack is delaying the push of the d pawn and castling instead. And if we face c3, we push the d pawn to d5. And this is a pawn sacrifice, and the main line continues e takes d5, knight takes d5, and now white has two attackers on our e pawn. So white takes it, we trade knights, and then we have to defend our knight on d5, which is under attack twice. And so we play c6, white typically plays d4, posting a pawn in the center of the board. We drive the rook back with bishop d6, it goes back to e1, and then we attack with queen to h4. Okay, white should block the attack with g3, and then we put our queen on h3. And this is where we left off from the last video. So let's take stock of the position again. Black is down a pawn, but he's developed better. He's got two minor pieces and a queen out. He's safely castled. And white hasn't developed anything yet on the queen side. And there are light squared weaknesses around the king over here, and black has a light squared bishop. So it's called the martial attack, which means black is going to be attacking that white king. Now let's continue from here, and I want to look at four different moves. Let's begin with the move bishop to e3. So white gets on with developing the queenside pieces, and he's getting the bishop out of the way so the knight can come to d2 later. And this bishop defends the king side and stabilizes things. Okay, after bishop e3, we'll play our bishop to g4, taking advantage of our light squared control, attacking the queen. And here, white should remember to play queen to d3. Let's point out what happens if he tries to block our attack with f3. That's a blunder. We get a strong attack after bishop takes g3. And white has to give up material to stave off mate. And it's even bad for white to take the bishop because if queen takes g3 check, and the king is forced to f1 because we have bishop takes f3 if he goes to h1. So king to f1. Then we can take on f3 anyway with a mate threat on g2 here, queen to g2, threatening the queen. It's just a disaster for white. He cannot hold in this position. Okay, so after we move our bishop to g4, white cannot block that attack. He has to move the queen, and he should remember to move it to d3. Now the point of remembering to move it to d3 is that if black plays bishop to f3 here to threaten mate on g2, then white saves himself by playing queen to f1. So that's why white did that maneuver. Okay, and after queen to f1, black doesn't really want to trade queens. He wants to keep queens on the board, so he'll play the queen back to possibly h5. But then white can play knight to d2 and attack our light squared bishop, and white's pieces are coming to life. He's getting developed, and he's getting this knight developed with tempo, and the attack is being repelled. So because of that, we're going to back up here, and after queen to d3, we're not going to play bishop to f3 and threaten mate because our bishop on f3 will be vulnerable to this tempo gaining move, knight to d2. So instead, I recommend rook a e8. Okay, putting the rook on the open file, and you may wonder why that rook and not the other rook. Well, this is a typical configuration of the rooks in the martial attack. And the reason is black often wants to push his f-pawn forward to f5 and then even to f4 to attack, and the f8 rook is well placed. The rook on e8 sometimes gets into the game by a rook lift to e6, and it can even transfer over to the h file sometimes, and black makes threats on h2. And pushing the pawn to f4 can block this bishop from defending that h6 square. Okay, now white typically plays knight to d2, and the game continues. And black's pieces are very active, and he has retained his control of the light squares, and he has some plans with these rooks and his f-pawn. Okay, let's back up to the position here after queen to h3 and look at some other continuations for white. Suppose white plays queen to e2. Now, I'm going to follow a grandmaster game played between Hou Yifan and Peter Leko in the 2013 Wijk tournament. And Leko had the black pieces, and he chose to play bishop to g4 here, attacking the queen. The queen went to f1. Queen to h5 followed. Okay, retaining the queens. When you're black, you often don't want to trade queens in the martial attack. You want to control the light squares and continue to attack. Okay, white played knight to d2, controlling that important f3 square. Then rook a e8, getting the rooks on the typical f and e files in the martial attack. And now white played f3, since the knight supports that pawn, and so does the queen. Now this does allow black to win the pawn back, but Leko didn't go for this. He could have played rook takes e1, drawing the queen away from the defense of the f3 pawn, and then he could take on f3. Okay, but then after this exchange of minor pieces, black's attack is completely gone. The material is even, but white has the bishop pair, and white has a pawn majority on the queen side. And this position gives white more chances to win than black. Black would have a hard time holding this. Okay, so Leko didn't go for that line, winning a pawn. Instead, he just kept his bishop on the board and moved it to h3. Okay, then the queen went up to f2, and now Leko traded rooks and then played a very instructive move here in the martial attack, bishop to f4. Often you do see a lot of tactics and sacrifices around the king side here. Now, Hou Yifan declined to take that bishop, but if she had, then the knight would come to life on the f4 square, and white might have a little trouble holding the position, even up a piece, because still his queenside pieces here are undeveloped, and these pieces look pretty threatening, and that king is wide open. And white might be able to repel the attack, but black might get at least a perpetual check. So white didn't accept that sacrifice and instead took the knight on d5. And then a trade of pieces took place. Okay, and then queen to e4 offering a queen trade. The queen fell back. Black wouldn't want to take that queen and let the f-pawn get to the e4 square and play that endgame. Okay, and then white put the rook on the e-file. And black retreated his bishop to block that e-file and then attack that pawn on a2. And white saved the pawn, and then rook e8. And the game continued from here with black playing a pawn down. But black has good drawing chances in this position due to the opposite colored bishops. And black has a plan of playing f6 and bringing the bishop back to f7 to contest the e-file. And the game did go on to be a draw. All right, let's go back to our key position after queen h3 and look at another continuation. Another move white sometimes plays here is rook to e4, lifting the rook forward. And to see what the threat is, suppose black blindly develops their light squared bishop and attacks the rook. Well, that's a blunder because of rook to h4, and all of a sudden we see the queen is trapped thanks to that bishop being in its way. So rook to e4 threatens rook to h4 in some cases, and so a good response to this move is g5 to protect that h4 square. And I know g5 is hanging to this bishop, but white can't take it because there would follow queen to f5, forking these pieces, and black would go up material and have a winning position. So g5 is a good prophylactic move, keeping the rook off of the h4 square. Okay, and then perhaps queen to f1 would follow, asking black to trade queens. Now it turns out trading queens is actually best for black in this position, even though black is still that pawn down. And after king takes f1, black gets a tempo on the rook and completes development. And black has some chances in this position, even with the queens off of the board. Okay, black is more active. All right, so going back to our key position here after queen to h3, we'll look at one more move. Queen to f3 is sometimes played, and that has the intention of maybe going to the g2 square and ejecting that queen and controlling the light squares and staving off any mates on g2. Well, then black can play bishop to g4, and then queen to g2, and queen to h5 to preserve the queens. And this is very similar to the Hou Yifan Leko game, but now the queen is on g2 rather than on f1. Play might continue bishop to e3, rook a e8. Again, these are the usual positions for the rooks in the martial attack. Then knight d2, completing the development of the minor pieces. Rook e6, lifting the rook. And just one continuation here for fun, I wanted to look at the move f3, attacking the bishop, just to show you how things can explode tactically here. Now, that did just leave control of this bishop, so black does best to take that bishop. And now the way white regains the material is to play queen to f2, attacking the knight. The bishop is still under attack, and white is also threatening to win an exchange on e6. It doesn't work for white to take the bishop and restore material that way with both queens hanging. It's very hard to calculate everything, but black is winning material here after taking the queen. White would have to recover black's queen, and now rook takes e1 check, wins a whole rook, and black is winning that position. Okay, so after black takes that bishop on e3, white has to play queen to f2 and get out of that attack by the knight and attack the knight himself. Okay, and the game could continue knight to d5, retreating the knight back and blocking that attack on the e6 rook. And then f takes g4, regaining the piece. Queen takes g4, and the material is now equal. So black got his pawn back in that particular line. So that's just a flavor of what can happen in the martial attack, and the 4 moves we looked at are 4 of the most common moves in the database. All right, thanks for watching.